Well, good morning, and welcome for taking time out on a cold Thursday morning to attend our press conference here this morning. I'm Mark Zimmerman, Friends of the Rail Bridge president. I'd like to just take a minute and introduce our board members that are present here this morning. We have Signe Snortland, Margie Enerson. I'm just looking around the room here. We have Eric Sacrison. Come on, help me out here. Everybody's spread out here now. That doesn't help me. Lyle Whittam. All right. I think we got everybody so far. Claudia. And Claudia, I'm sorry. So here we go. And Claudia Berg. All right, let's get started here this morning. Go big or go home. Certainly all of us have heard or used that expression when thinking of being bold in our words and actions. The organizers behind America's railroads during the glory years of westward expansion, including the Northern Pacific Railroad, were bold in their ambitions to build a transcontinental railroad. George Shattuck Morrison decided to go big or go home when he designed and constructed what was then considered an engineering marvel, the rail bridge at Bismarck-Mandan. Immigrant farmers and ranchers personified the go big or go home philosophy by taking that bold step to move to the prairies and the Badlands, often crossing the bridge at Bismarck-Mandan to carve out a life for their families and establish a legacy for future generations of North Dakotans. Go big or go home was a philosophy of early Bismarck civic leaders as they parlayed the railroad and this bridge to the west in establishing their community as a territorial capital and the future capital of the state of North Dakota. Now we have the opportunity to go big or go home in our efforts to save our beloved and iconic rail bridge. Friends of the Rail Bridge, or FORB, have been bold since its formation in 2017 to work for the preservation and repurposing of the bridge. FORB has been bold when others doubted the effort in working with local and national partner agencies and organizations to work through all the regulatory requirements and mandates that guarantee that the voice of all people be heard and acknowledged in the permitting process for construction of a new bridge. Bold has been the action of FORB to highlight the history of the bridge, the social, economic, and cultural impact the bridge has had on our community, our state, and the nation for the past 140 years. FORB will continue to be bold in our efforts to preserve the bridge, bold and imaginative in our action in the repurposing of the bridge, and bold in our work for future generations to enjoy this part of our heritage, our everyday life, and the future of our community and nation. At this time, I wish to introduce Lyle Whittam, our in-house counsel for Friends of the Rail Bridge.
Thanks, Mark. No hurries. My name is Lyle Whittam, as Mark just said, and I am a lawyer. I practiced environmental and natural resource law in North Dakota for about 30 years. I was one of the few lawyers lucky enough to do that. It was the work I loved, and for 16 of those years, I was an assistant AG for North Dakota in the Natural Resources Division of the AG's office. And I was fortunate enough to work on some really important and exciting cases that really did good work for North Dakota. One of those cases involved the Burlington Northern Railroad in Mandan, and after a few years of litigation, the big oil spill under the Mandan Rail Yard was cleaned up, a $30 million settlement, and that was an important step for that community. This case involving this bridge is probably more important than that case was. And for some reason, the Burlington Northern Railroad thought the only issues they had to deal with this bridge was federal permitting. And that's not true. What we're here to do today is talk to you about the state law permitting issues. And those are significant. And when I got involved, was asked to look at this case about 1.5 years ago, it was obvious to me that a lot of the important legal issues were overlooked and or misrepresented by the railroad. And so what I'm going to give you now are a few written remarks about that. The legal issues are kind of complicated, but really interesting if you want to dig into them. And we've got all sorts of materials up here to do that if you're interested in taking home some reading material. And then afterwards, after we've finished all of our presentations, we'll answer questions. So if you have any questions about some of these issues, please ask them at that time. So we'll be happy to address those. We also have some of our yard signs. My daughter, Ann, is the secretary for FORB. She's not able to be here today. But she told me to make sure, because there's some people that have requested those signs, and she's told me to make sure that I at least put them out. So those of you that are entitled to those or have ordered those signs, please take them when you go home. Friends of the Rail Bridge, or FORB, do not oppose building a new railway bridge between Bismarck and Mandan. FORB, in fact, supports building a new railroad bridge. But FORB also supports preserving the existing structurally sound historic bridge for the reasons stated by Governor Burgum in his May 2021 interview with the Bismarck Tribune. That's summarized in one of those comments are summarized in one of the letters over there on the table. FORB reiterates those reasons for preserving the historic bridge in FORB's November 21st letter, requesting a hearing before the North Dakota Department of Water Resources and the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality, used to be called the Health Department. The purpose of that hearing is to address the numerous legal and factual issues that the law requires the state agencies in question to address before permits to tear down and replace the existing single-track bridge may be granted. The current historic single-track bridge remains structurally sound, as I said. The bridge has been used for rail transport almost continuously for the past 140 years, and BNSF plans to continue to use it during construction as it builds the new bridge just 30 feet away. If the proposed new two-track bridge is built and lasts the same 140-year time period as the historic single-track bridge has, BNSF is making a decision that will fundamentally change the kinds of communities Bismarck and Mandan will be until the year 2162. That's 140 years from now. A decision that so fundamentally alters the future of the Bismarck-Mandan community in our state must not be made without first going through a robust hearing process that addresses the legal and factual issues that North Dakota law requires. There are 3 sets of legal issues that must be addressed before a permit may be granted to destroy the historic single-track bridge and replace it with a two-track bridge. First, what is the impact of running more trains at faster speeds on 2 tracks through the center of our community for the next up to 140 years? Who will pay for all the crossings that will have to be altered? These are not issues that have been addressed in the federal permitting process, and they should have been. Does it really make sense to run these double tracks through the center of Bismarck and Mandan for the next 140 years? If not, what are the other options? Taking a hard look at the alternatives is the fundamental thing that both state and federal law require before such a permanent and momentous decision is made. That has not happened in this case. when a large project is broken down into smaller segments to avoid consideration of the full impacts of the entire project, that is called in the law segmentation. The law does not allow segmentation to be used as a way to avoid consideration of the full social and environmental impacts of a project. Second, for most of recorded human history, waterways have not been privately owned. This is not a new principle of law. This is not some new concept. This is one of the fundamental and oldest principles of the law. Rather than being privately owned, they belong to the public for travel, fishing, recreation, and other forms of navigation and public use up to every navigable water body's ordinary high water mark. This rule of law dates back to Roman times and has been an established principle of American constitutional, statutory, and common law, both federal and state, for the past 170 years. The riverbed beneath the historic 1883 Northern Pacific Railroad Bridge is not a privately owned exception to this fundamental rule that riverbeds belong to the public. Rather, the Missouri riverbed below the historic bridge was transferred to North Dakota when it was the 39th state admitted to the Union on November 2nd, 1889. The North Dakota Supreme Court recognized state ownership of this stretch of the Missouri riverbed between Bismarck and Mandan in a case that was being litigated when I began working in the Natural Resources Division of the Attorney General's Office in 1990. There have been, as recently as 2020, the Supreme Court decided an issue reaffirming that decision. And in 2012, there was another important case. They're cited in our letter. You can pick it up. And there's currently these same issues are being litigated with the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribe as to the riverbed up in north of us on the Fort Berthold reservation, within the boundaries of that reservation. So those issues are a little different because it involves a treaty, but the same fundamental issues of interpretation apply. So this is a very hotly contested issue. It should have come as no surprise to anybody that this issue should have been addressed from the beginning of the federal permitting process. All of that original case happened in the early 1990s, more than 100 years after the Missouri's riverbed was transferred to North Dakota in 1889. The point is that it is not unusual for this issue to arise more than a century after the original transfer, and the old laws in existence then are still the law today. Since the historic bridge has been in use for 140 years, it should come as no shock to anyone that these legal issues were not raised for 140 years. There was no reason for them to be raised until the harm of losing our community's most important landmark caused them to be raised, which in this case happens to be 140 years later. When I began working as an assistant attorney general in 1990, it was more than 112 years after the 1877 Dakota territorial law was enacted that made into statutory law the common law doctrine that any permanent fixture attached to the land becomes part of the land. This is basic. If your house is on the land, when you get a deed, you get your house. If a sidewalk, which is an easement across your land, is part of the land, that comes with your house, and that comes with it. That does not transfer ownership of that land underneath that sidewalk to anybody else. That still belongs to you. Same with this bridge. Same basic principle. In North Dakota, there is no common law where there is statutory law. But this is a statutory law. This principle of common law, that the fixture is part of the real estate, was made part of the statutory law of Dakota Territory in 1877. That's a really important point because when the bridge was built 3 years later in 1880 to 1883, that was the law. This remained the controlling law in effect at the time that both the riverbed beneath the historic bridge as well as the historic bridge as an attached fixture was transferred to North Dakota under the Equal Footing Doctrine in 1889. The Equal Footing Doctrine was recognized by the North Dakota Supreme Court in that case. I think it was actually finally decided by the Supreme Court in 1992. Again, in that 2012 case I talked about, and again a couple years ago in the 2020 case involving mineral interests under the riverbed. So I'll quickly get off on a sidetrack if I start on down that trail. So I will stop there. But it's just established law. That's the point. This is not something strange. This is not unusual. This is not frivolous. This is what the law is and has been for 150 years. Okay? The 1877 statute question still remains the unaltered controlling statutory law in North Dakota in 2022. 145 years after the 1877 territorial legislature enacted it. The existing historic bridge cannot be destroyed without first addressing the issues of ownership of the riverbed and the historic bridge itself. And that is one of the issues that we have asked them to address in these administrative hearings. Third and finally, BNSF is proposing to put 3 new piers within the Missouri River space between the 2 existing piers of the historic bridge that are still within the channel of the river. There are actually 4 piers. There are 2 in the channel. You can see here, and you can see the ice problem that I'll talk about in a second. Okay. These 2 piers have been embedded in the shale bedrock approximately 40 feet below the riverbed for the past 140 years. BNSF is proposing to remove the 2 existing 140-year-old piers to a level only 2 feet below the existing riverbed, leaving an additional 38 feet embedded into the shale bedrock below. So you have all this silt on top of the bedrock, and that silt is, whenever the water flows through it, moves it around. And if you have 5 piers across the river, that's going to be a problem, lined up within 30 feet of each other. Having all 5 of these pier foundations, 3 new and 2 old, is so closely spaced within the existing channel is likely to cause ice jams, silting, flooding, and other water quality and navigational issues after the new bridge is completed. BNSF did not publicly release its plans to remove the existing 140-year-old piers to a level only 2 feet below the riverbed until its recent filing with the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality. BNSF's request to destroy the existing historic bridge, but only to remove the existing piers to just 2 feet below the riverbed, will cause all the potential water quality and flooding issues that entails. This issue must be addressed before any state permits can be granted. It defies both the laws of physics and common sense to tear down the beautiful and useful parts of the existing historic bridge, but leave most of the existing piers in place just below the top of the riverbed to cause future harm. Again, without any of the benefits that preserving the entire historic bridge would bring, as talked about Mark in his opening comments, and as Amy Sackerson will address more in a little more detail in a couple of minutes. FORB's November 21st letters to the North Dakota Departments of Environmental Quality and Water Resources, as well as the U.S. Coast Guard and the Federal Emergency Management Administration, 3 separate letters, all on the table, set forth these issues in more detail. These letters ask the state and federal agencies to address the legal, factual, and procedural deficiencies and administrative oversights outlined in FORB's letters and comments. By doing so, these agencies will have a chance to correct these errors through the administrative process. This is the right thing to do under the law, and also for the future generations who will get to enjoy the historic bridge as a landmark and essential link between the Bismarck and Mandan communities, for enjoyment of one of the most beautiful and historically significant riverfronts in the Upper Great Plains. And I would love to talk another 20 minutes about That is a treasure. That riverfront has more history in it than any other place in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, or Montana. I'd challenge you to find any place that has Lewis and Clark, the Verendrye expedition 20 years before Lewis and Clark, the Mandan villages there for 1,000 years, the Fort Lincoln and all that history with Custer, all of that, all within a few miles of a riverfront. And the fact that the Bismarck community may not, and the Mandan community may not take advantage of that and create that resource for the people of the North Dakota for the next 100 or 200 years is a tragedy. You can tell it just infuriates me. In sum, there are three sets of legal issues that must be addressed under state law. First, the law requires an honest and hard look at the preservation alternative. This has not occurred because the project has been segmented in a way that prevented any hard look at the impacts of running more trains at faster speeds on true tracks through the center of Bismarck for the next 75 to 150 years. Second, both the river bed beneath the bridge and the bridge itself belong to the people of North Dakota as transferred to them under the equal footing doctrine in 1889. The railroad cannot tear down something they do not own under long established and unchanged law dating back decades before the bridge was built or the 1864 Act that created the Northern Pacific Transcontinental Railroad was enacted. That's a complicated legal issue I haven't gotten into. But we've got the memos there, or if you want to read them, they're online. And I challenge you, and it's a really interesting part of United States history as well as North Dakota history. And it involves some of the most fundamental issues, the Civil War and the writing of the Constitution. They were all grounded in the equal footing doctrine. Again, that's a long... Third, if you're going to tear down the existing bridge, you can't just do half the job. During flood events and ice jams, the river scours down to as much as 10 feet below the current riverbed. That happened in the 2011 flood. And silt will accumulate directly downriver if you put 5 piers across the channel in a way that will cause silt accumulation. The North Dakota Departments of Environmental Quality and Water Resources cannot issue permits to destroy the historic 1883 bridge until all of these issues are addressed. These letters and comments are available on the front table, as I've said many times. And if you have any questions after Amy and Mark finish their comments, I will, and the rest of us will be up here and willing to answer them. The next speaker is Amy Sackerson. She's North Dakota's advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm sorry I went way over the amount of time I was supposed to, but once I get going.
I've known you for a lot of years, Lyle.
It's the first time.
I'm not raising my hand because I'm not surprised. Anyway, thank you. And I hope Mark doesn't have to get out of the way, but at any rate, I am North Dakota's advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And as that advisor, in May of 2019, I was honored to announce, well, honored is not exactly the word I'd probably really like to say, but I announced that the Bismarck-Mandan Rail Bridge was named by the Trust to its 2019 list of America's 11 most endangered historic places. Today, the historic 1883 rail bridge still stands, spanning the Missouri River, an icon of profound historic and symbolic significance in the American landscape. It has been recognized as eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places by the North Dakota State Historic Preservation Officer, but it is still under threat. From the beginning, the National Trust has supported the Friends of the Rail Bridge in their valiant and ongoing efforts to seek an alternative, a compromise solution that would prevent the destruction of this bridge. Today, the Trust reaffirms its support for those efforts, including legal action, to set a path forward for the preservation of our bridge. The Trust has been protecting America's historic buildings, landscapes, and neighborhoods for more than 60 years. Places like Antietam National Battlefield, Jamestown, Virginia, Washington's Mount Vernon, and Roosevelt's Elkhorn Ranch, also a site here in North Dakota. These all have been threatened by neglect, insufficient funds, inappropriate development, or insensitive public policy. According to the National Park Service, quote, historic places have powerful and provocative stories to tell. As witnesses to the past, they recall real events that shaped history and actual people who faced those situations and issues. Places make connections across time that give them a special ability to create an empathetic understanding of what happened and why, end quote. Jay Clemens, former chair of the Board of Trustees of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, shared this message on the occasion of the 2019 announcement, and I quote him, "As a Bismarck-Mandan native, born in Bismarck and raised in Mandan, I am delighted to support the local and national efforts to preserve our old railroad bridge. Few structures embody so many of the complex historical themes associated with the opening of the Upper Missouri region to settlement, opportunities for immigrants, and the corresponding dislocation and subjugation of Native peoples, the economic and political power of the railroads, the resulting rise of prairie populism, and the strains and opportunities associated with an increasingly smaller world and faster access to information and commodities. Many of these themes challenge us as much today as they did when this bridge was built. I love the thought of the bridge becoming a pedestrian walkway, a place where local residents and visitors can enjoy peaceful vistas of the Missouri while contemplating past lessons and future challenges," end quote. Jay's message is as pertinent now as it was in 2019. Loss of this bridge should be unthinkable to us. It is so much more than stone and steel, the span of its silhouette against the horizon. It is a bridge to our past and to understanding who we are, a bridge to our future, and to the promise of what can be. Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Amy. I think we can see the passion that Lyle presented here and his great legal work. When I read that material, I know I'm no attorney, so I don't play one on TV either. So, well, you've heard the passion and commitment of Friends of the Rail Bridge to the mission of preserving and repurposing our beloved rail bridge. Know that several thousand people have signed a petition to save the bridge, and literally every day people are stepping up and inquiring as to the future of the bridge, voicing their hopes that it will remain a part of our community, part of our landscape, and more importantly, a part of our civic pride and culture. This bridge belongs to all of us. Today, the bridge is an iconic landmark for the community and state. Its image is ubiquitous, appearing in everything from corporate advertising, news media backdrops, to family portraits. Along with the North Dakota State Capitol, this bridge is the most visible structure that identifies Bismarck and Mandan. Let it span for future generations. It is not hard to imagine the bridge continuing to span the mighty Missouri River at Bismarck-Mandan. An amazing physical bridge that has stood for over 140 years and can stand for another 140. Theodore Roosevelt crossed the Missouri River shortly after this bridge was opened on his first trip to Medora. He credits his time in North Dakota as a reason for running for president. As our state and private donors are investing in the Theodore Roosevelt Library in Medora, it would be unfortunate to lose the bridge at a time when the interest in Theodore Roosevelt will be growing and attracting people to North Dakota. It's a bridge to the past and our future. It will serve as a bridge to our past, to teach this and future generations the story of our state and nation. Preserving and repurposing the rail bridge is an opportunity to utilize and elevate an existing asset to the benefit of our community. Preserving the rail bridge will produce numerous benefits beyond recreation and tourism, including fostering civic pride, increasing historic awareness, and stimulating economic development along the Missouri River. Some of our greatest attractions in the area are the historic sites within the view of this great bridge. And again, Lyle's passion, speaking of all of those great historic places along the Missouri River, are unique to us. A repurposed bridge is economically, cultural, and environmentally feasible, according to a 2019 feasibility study conducted by our own NDSU Landscape Architecture. In addition to considering repurposing the historic bridge, the feasibility study considers how a repurposed bridge would connect with the existing public trail systems on the east and west sides of the Missouri River. It is a recreational opportunity serve as a wonderful recreational opportunity for walkers, and cyclists, connecting the trail system in Bismarck-Mandan, extending for miles down to Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park, north to, there's one right to Harmon Lake. Thank you, Eric. Harmon Lake, there we go. Like the North Dakota Department of Commerce and our tourism division, we should all embrace the tourism marketing with workforce development to retain and attract people who want to live in a vibrant community, a community that cares about its iconic past and provides the outdoor recreation that a rail-to-trail conversion would create. There are numerous examples of rail bridge conversions that have had major recreational, cultural, and economic successes. The Stone Arch Bridge in Minneapolis is just one of several in our area. Built in 1883, this former rail bridge crosses the Mississippi River at St. Anthony Falls. In the summer, that bridge is a hub of community activity, including an arts festival. As I stated in my opening remarks, FORB is committed to bold actions in regard to the historic and iconic rail bridge. The designers, engineers, and common laborers faced many challenges in the design and construction of the bridge. They were bold. They knew they were building something for the here and now in Bismarck and the United States. They also knew they were building for their future and their children's future. Let us continue to be bold in our love and action for the bridge for now and generations to come. Thank you all for attending. We would certainly be open to some questions. Yeah, David. Next step. Lyle. You would not want me answering a legal question.
Me either.
The state law issues are not just an afterthought, and state law requires that we exhaust all administrative remedies before we file any legal action. And these are actually permit proceedings. There's a sovereign lands permit that has to be issued by the state engineer, and then there's a water quality permit that has to be issued by the North Dakota DEQ, or Department of Environmental Quality. But we have also requested an investigatory hearing to address, you can't issue a permit to tear down the bridge unless you know that they have a right to tear down the bridge, and to have a right to tear down the bridge, they have to own that bridge. The United States Coast Guard told us that they couldn't do anything about this bridge because the railroad owned that bridge, and that's when we presented them the evidence that the ownership of the bridge and the river bed beneath the bridge belongs to the people of North Dakota. Also, there's a process It requires approval by the North Dakota Historical Preservation Board. Did I say that right, Signe? No. Okay, what's the right? The State Historical Board. The State Historical Board under North Dakota Statute 550207, and that requires that any historical object, structure, house, building located on state-owned property has to, before it can be torn down, has to get approval from the State Historic Board. And that has not occurred. That is supposed to be under the regulations part of the process of getting a permit, a sovereign land permit to build the bridge and to tear down the existing bridge. That's a lot longer answer than you wanted, I think, Dave, but it's a complicated process. If they refuse to go through that process, then we go into the court, okay? And that's another long explanation, but there's something called, both under federal and state law, there's something called a Declaratory Judgment Act, and that's probably one of the 2 or 3 statutes we would under both state and federal law. There's separate acts that we would use to if these issues that I just talked about are not addressed by the state. So there's also other things, other remedies depending on what the state agencies decide to do or not do. So anyway.
Other questions? I think Lyle's explanation here too, again, to me reaffirms our commitment. We're not this group that just, okay, yeah, we want to save the bridge and we're not doing anything about it. We're committed to this, and we hope that people will realize that commitment. There's a question over there, Aaron?
Yeah, Lyle, in 2 to 4 sentences, you had referenced it's like a 58-page, as a historian, I'm complimenting you as a legal brief or memo that you prepared, but you referenced black letter law. Could you unpack that just briefly, or as briefly as can, black letter law, how it applies to this bridge?
I certainly can. And 4 sentences, maybe 10. Okay. So in 1953, Congress passed the Submerged Land Act, and that act has specific language. That act makes clear that the state owns, that states, not just North Dakota, all 50 states own the riverbeds of navigable rivers within their borders. Okay. And the reason that law was passed in 1953 was mostly to address the fact that they not only own the riverbed, but they own the minerals beneath the riverbed, and that's all the litigation that's going on in North Dakota over the mineral rights, the Bakken stuff. But the black letter law is basically, when the Constitution was formed, it was critical that any new state that was admitted to the Union was made part. They had the same rights and the same privileges that all the original 13 colonies had. That's called the equal footing doctrine. And one of the fundamental parts of that equal footing doctrine was what's called the public trust doctrine, which is basically this rule that because navigation was the key way that commerce was done for most of human history. So this law, this public trust doctrine, going back to Roman times, is a fundamental principle that allowed ships to come in and out of harbors, and people from not being able to block rivers from boats coming up and down. That it was a fundamental law. That's so established law that it's called black letter law. So when I talk about black letter law, I'm talking about those fundamental constitutional and common law principles that were embodied in North Dakota law, in that 1877 law I talked about, including that one of that fundamental common law doctrines is if something's built on a piece of land, when you buy that piece of land, you get that building. If a bridge is built on a riverbed and it's transferred to the state of North Dakota, that bridge goes with the riverbed to the state of North Dakota. The one exception to that rule is if there would have been something in the 1864 Act that specifically addressed that issue. There is no language in the act that did that. So that means that under the rules of interpretation, the same rules they're arguing about in the Mandan Hidatsa Irikara, that if it isn't explicitly mentioned, that fundamental black letter law is the law, and that is what the railroad has to deal with, and that means the riverbed is owned by the state under the rules of interpretation and that fundamental rule that applies, and the bridge as a fixture attached to that riverbed was after it was built and finished in 1883, when the state North Dakota became a state in 1889, and that riverbed was transferred to the state, that became state property too. Now, the fact that that issue didn't come up for 140 years, I tried to give you a background. That's not surprising, as I said. Anyway, it's way more than 10 sentences. So, anyway, once I get going, I can't stop. Sorry.
So if there's any hearing or legal action, it will be triggered when the railroad finally seeks a permit to build New Bridge, correct?
Yeah, they have applied for a sovereign lands permit with the State Water Commission. They did so in 2017. Implicit in that application is the fact that they're admitting that the state owns the riverbed, because you don't need a permit, a sovereign land permit, if they own the riverbed. And then, after 2017, they decided not to pursue that sovereign land permit. They decided to put it on the back shelf for some reason. I think it's because of this ownership issue that we talked about. And now they've asked, just a few weeks ago, the Water Commission to go ahead with that sovereign land permit. So we have requested that they include it in that sovereign land permit administrative process addressing the issue of ownership, because in the memo I wrote in February of this year, and the railroad responded in March, and then I responded with the long April 4th memo, the 58-page memo laying all the background law. That was to set the stage, and that 1953 law that I cite, the congressional law, the Submerged Law Act law, has explicit language that says the law in effect at the time of the transfer is the law that determines ownership. That's federal law, but that's also basic common law and basic constitutional law and basic property law and contract law in North Dakota. All of those rules of interpretation say that we're correct on that. So, go ahead, Don.
Can you talk a little bit to the issue of segmentation, how the EIS only addressed the removal of the bridge and not what the impact of removal of the bridge and adding a double track and what that impact across the entire state could be?
Yeah. It's 4 sentences. So, segmentation means that they wanted to only address the issue of permitting the bridge itself. Don't pay any attention that we're talking about 2 tracks instead of 1. Don't pay any attention to the fact that we stated in the original scoping document that we were going to build 2 tracks, and that's the reason we can't continue to use the historic bridge. Don't pay any attention to any of that. But we have to build a new bridge because we need 2 tracks for the future. But we don't have to consider any of those environmental impacts until we actually decide to put the 2nd track on the bridge. That is segmentation. What the law requires when you look at the environmental impacts is you look at the whole impact of the whole project. That includes the effects of putting 2 tracks through Bismarck and Mandan and across the rest of North Dakota, all those crossings. Who pays for all those crossings? Does the railroad pay for those crossings? No. Most of that money, about 80 to 90%, is usually paid for with federal matching funds, but then the state and local governments pay for the rest of those. And they are actually terrified if they take on the railroad that that the railroad's going to make it difficult for them or refuse to do those crossings. So if you want to know the real reason why they don't want to take on this bridge is because they're afraid of that issue. And that is a sad thing, and that is the honest truth. And Okay, I better stop there. Anybody? Hi, Sarah.
I was just thinking about the idea of two tracks going through downtown Bismarck. What would be left of downtown Bismarck if two tracks went through?
You're going to have to probably do underpasses under most of those streets, I would think. There are a few of them.
What about the buildings?
The buildings will be impacted. If you're sitting in a building in downtown Bismarck in the spring, when the ground is thawing, you can feel that building move when those trains go through downtown Bismarck. We're talking longer trains going faster with heavier loads going through Bismarck for the next 100 years. Does it make any sense to do that, at least without considering that impact? The railroad has rights of way up around the northern part to go out north in Bismarck and south of Bismarck. Why weren't those considered? Why wasn't it considered that you can build the track instead of 30 feet away, you could build it out, as the photos show that we had up here, created by the NDSU folks. If you go 70 or 80 feet up north, it's easy to preserve the bridge and have those pathways underneath the bridge and all those things. And you can then set other limits. The other thing that's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years, almost certainly, is we're going to have electric trains like they do in Europe. So you're building a bridge that's not going to be set up to address the changes that we know there is going to happen in the next couple decades. What sense does that make? Spending $50,000, $60,000 million instead of $70 or $80 million for a bridge that's not going to be useful without major changes to address the changes we know are coming. This is just this whole thing of trying to put a little box around what you consider and not address the obvious things that are going to happen is just wrong.
Well, I'd like to Sarah's question was great, what would happen to downtown Bismarck, but it's also reasonable to consider that the same thing would happen across the state,
Yes,
across the city center.
every little town, every county, every road out in the middle of the prairie, farm road. It's a huge cost, and they want to say, well, I don't need to repeat myself.
So not only small towns and crossings and that type of thing, but all of the major cities as well that run along the
Yes, Jamestown, Valley City, Fargo, the bridge over the Cheyenne River, and the James River bridges, especially the Cheyenne one at Valley City. So it's a huge thing, and they want us. They say, well, we haven't made up our mind yet about whether we want two tracks. We know that the Pacific trade is going to happen. We know that the major ports are going to be in Tacoma and Portland. We know that extra traffic is going to come across. We know they're going to take the shortest route. We know that route's going to be through North Dakota. Are they going to build the resources that we can have our commodities part of that? Are they going to build the resources that will allow that to serve the North Dakota community? I doubt it. Not if we don't stand up to them. Have our politicians done that? No, they have not. They have. I better stop again. Eric?
I'll pose it as a question, because you didn't bring it up. Doesn't the railroad have squatters' rights because they've used it for all these years?
No, they do not. There's an interesting provision of the North Dakota Constitution, a section that says there is no adverse possession against the state. So no longer, it doesn't matter how long that they have owned it, they do not acquire ownership over time just because they've been using it for 140 years. That's just that's a principle of North Dakota constitutional law. So.
In the back had a question?
Yeah, if you save the bridge,
who would assume liability of the bridge? And is there a ballpark estimate of how much it would cost?
So the governor mentioned the bridges in Austin. Mark mentioned the bridge in downtown Minneapolis. That becomes part of that community. The cost of setting up the bridge is about $6.97 million. The cost of maintaining a bridge once you build that infrastructure, I don't think is that much. And the tourist, you got to look at not just that cost, but you got to look at the value to the community. The governor talks about it. We do not have to make this point. If you read our November 21st letter, the governor in his interview with the Bismarck Tribune talked about all these things and how this could be a tremendous hub for tourism and for community events for all of this region, and especially the Bismarck-Mandan community. That's worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. So the fact that somebody is worried about, and almost always, just like building a underpass underneath the railroad is usually done with 80% matching federal funds. There are all sorts of grants available, federal grants, probably under the two most recent $1 trillion acts Congress has passed for building this kind of infrastructure to do something like this. So all we have to do is to have the vision and the courage to go ahead and do the same things that every other community that has some historic resource like this has done and made it into something extremely valuable for that community. And why we're not willing to do that in this case, I don't know.
Thank you. But let's get into the first part of the question. Who would the liability fall onto? Like the state?
Liability? Are you talking about liability or the cost? Well, the cost is about $7 million, and the governor said he was willing to work with folks to help raise that money and to work with the legislature to get that. They just spent $10 million for the Science Center overlooking this bridge up here. The legislature did that, and a similar amount for something in Jamestown. We are talking about less money than that for something that will have orders of magnitude, at least one order of magnitude more value to the community long-term than those projects. So, yes, there'll be state matching funds, there'll be federal funds. FORB will work with others to get private funds for that, but this is a small amount compared to even the Science Center. So that's an issue that the railroad planted in the minds of local politicians, and that issue is a red herring as far as I'm concerned in relationship to the actual benefits and costs. If you're going to talk about that, you better talk about both the benefits and the costs before you try and scare people away because it's going to cost a few $1 million of public-private partnership money to do these projects.
In FORB's discussion over the years with different institutions such as the National Trust and Rails Conservancy and things like that, there are a lot of partners that will be available for the state. The state, we believe, owns it, but there are partners in addition to federal funds and state funds. There are other national partners out there that these new partnerships can be formed to make this a really wonderful project to pull everybody from across the country in.
Wouldn't it cost that much to tear it down? And
Yeah,
build it up?
exactly. And they are, and as I said, they are not addressing the biggest cost, which is leaving those piers in the river they're going to cause huge environmental problems with silting and other things. That if you're going to tear it down, you have to take out the whole thing and remove that problem. So go ahead.
Just as Lyle said in this, one of his last comments, and Amy as well, but the issue, or not the issue, but one of the things to really take into consideration when asking these questions on who will own it, how it will be taken care of, what it will cost, is private-public partnership.
Yes.
That is so imperative to consider, because that is how most of these amenities come to life. Gateway to Science Center is a fantastic
It is.
example, because that is a private-public partnership. So it's a private group that receive funding from the state and other entities. That is so critical to building community.
And that's what's so exciting about this project, to me. You know, we have such a beautiful preservation opportunity that can really build all kinds of connections that will better North Dakota and better the rest of the country. This bridge was part of the building of this country, so I think the whole country gets to be part of its future. All those partnerships that will be formed will be really wonderful to see.
Any other questions? So Mark had to go catch a plane, and I'm not really in charge, but I guess we want to thank you all for coming. This is a really important resource for our community. And as the governor said in his interview with the Tribune, and as we quote him in our letter on November 21st letter, there's no reason this bridge has to come down. So you can leave it up safely for a decade or so while we address all these cost issues. And if at the end of it we can't address some of the questions, we can't find those partnerships, it costs no more to take it down then. It costs no more. So and there is no public safety or health issue that would justify taking it down now before we explore those alternatives. So I challenge you to go out into this community and really ask people to take a second look at this, because it has not been considered under the laws that apply and under the public policy issues that should have been considered. And as I said, it was the railroad that chose to not pursue the state permitting issues until they thought they were near done with the federal permitting issues. So it's not our fault that these issues have not been addressed until the administrative hearings that allow us to raise them are occurring now after all that 5-year process on this federal permitting. So thank you again for coming here.